All right, so welcome officially. I'm glad that you were able to make time on your Saturday to be here with me. This it's a brief conversation about some of the ideas that I do in some of the trainings that I've been doing. We're organizing the conference for IAAGT in Veracruz in September this year. So I'm going to be doing a pre-conference workshop there for 8 hours. That's a little bit deeper dive to some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And then in November, I'll be in Budapest and in Sofia as well, doing a 2-day training. And then here in the States, we're going to do something with the Gestalt Institute of Philadelphia on November. So, if you're interested in any of that, we can connect later. But let me start by giving you a little bit of context to some of the stuff that I'm going to be sharing today. I always feel it's important to start with giving a little bit of an introduction, and not just of the theory aspects of it, but more so that there's a big part of what I'm sharing that in retrospect, it's connected to obvious life experiences as well as professional experiences. And so I always like to give it a little bit of context of a little piece of my story that's very significant to what I'm going to be talking about today. So I have said this in many other platforms, but a brief little synopsis. I grew up in a family where there was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of drinking. All my uncles on my mom's side were heavy drinkers. And from a very young age, every family get together, it was a big party and a big fight. And normally in that order. Sometimes there was party, fight, party, because there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of consumption. And I remember growing up feeling that this is how every family was until I started going to other friends' family get-togethers and realized that people don't get intoxicated, that adults don't get intoxicated every time they have a gathering. But when I started university and started to get into psychology, I remember having this clear thought that the last thing that I wanted to do was work with addiction. And at that time, addiction for me was synonymous to substance abuse. So it just felt this unfixable, and so hard, so difficult to do. And I think that in some shape or form, from talking to different clinicians and Gestalt therapists in different parts of the world, I think that feels true for a lot of us, that it feels like addiction is this thing that's over there and it's hard to deal with. So a big part of the motivation to start doing the speaking, start doing the trainings, because I think that a change of paradigm in our understanding of addiction, it's really important, and it really makes a difference in how we're able to approach the relationship. So there's a really big part of this that is related to open up the field of understanding addiction, and also how important it is to change how we connect with people who are struggling. And soon after graduation, and I started working, one of my first jobs was in a psychiatric hospital, because I was very fascinated by severe mental illness, and trauma was very much of the foreground for me in terms of the work that's important. People with schizophrenia, there was a lot of people that you could see their stories shaping through in terms of some of those unresolved pains. A lot of the delusions, a lot of the hallucinations at times were connected to unprocessed trauma. So there was this very clear sense of how important it was to work with trauma. Once again, this is not necessarily a great awareness, but it was just very interested to see how palpable it was. And eventually I ended up deciding to work in an intensive outpatient program with substance abuse and recovery. I was looking for a challenge. This came along, and I decided, why not? And I was amazingly surprised of how much I enjoyed that work, and especially people in early recovery. They're in a very raw, vulnerable pace, because all those anesthetized emotions start coming to surface, all those things that haven't been processed start coming to surface. And I had this realization that for me was noble and amazing. And then I found out that it's very common in the literature, which is then most people with substance abuse disorders have trauma in their history, some sort of traumatic experiences in their history. So at the end of the day, recovery is trauma work. And that just connected for me, and it made sense. And it became this integrated part of the work that felt really connected. What happened through the years is that I started working and understanding addiction in a broader sense, which is a lot of what we're going to talking about today. So understanding that there's multiple ways that compulsive behaviors can become overwhelming and controlling in somebody's life: sex, love, gambling, buying, eating, etc. So that opening of that view was really shifting for me, because it gave me a better understanding that what we're looking at here is the need to anesthetize more than the behavior that's destructive. And as I started working in private practice and specializing in trauma, there's a lot of people that come to me or come to us that we are trauma experts, quote unquote, but I don't even know what that means, that come to work on specific traumatic events. They have a better sense of their story. They've been doing some therapy maybe, and they want to work on this. And what was really interesting is that I found that even people who come seeking treatment for trauma have found addictive ways of compensating that pain. And it might not be substance abuse, it might be work, or it might be falling in love. And there are some compulsive behaviors that, as a society, in a greater sense, we tend to glorify. Somebody who's a very hard worker and provider and successful and makes a lot of money might seem like someone who is a great example of who you're supposed to be. But then when you look at their life and the consequences, they're working, 80 hours a week. They're tired. They're not taking care of their health. Their relationships with their family are severely impacted. Their physical health is impacted. Their mental health is impacted. And when you see the consequences of that, the difference between the alcoholic and the workaholic, I don't love those terms, but just to use them, it's really not that different. I mean, I'm not saying substances don't have an impact in our nervous system. Of course they do. But the change of the chemistry of non-substance abuse addictive behaviors and substance abuse behaviors, it's doing something very similar to the chemistry of the brain. Because addiction, at the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal, to change the chemistry of the brain. So there was a sense that the relationship between trauma and addiction is so much more closer, and it felt really important to talk about it. So that's just to give a little bit of background in terms of some of the ideas I'm going to be sharing with you today. Along the way, please, if you have any comments, any questions, go ahead and ask. As I said, at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for dialogue and conversation. I could definitely talk for hours on end. Trust me, I have done it. And you will walk away probably a little bit bored, and I will think, oh, that was wonderful. I spoke for 3 hours nonstop. So to avoid the discomfort for both of us and my delusional thinking, let's please ask away if there's anything that comes along. So
I just want to make a comment that I'm with you so far, and really agree about this idea of the trauma base for addictions, and looking at it that way being so different from looking at it in terms of just behavior.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm excited to keep listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liv. So let's jump into it. So one of the challenges about understanding addiction times is, well, at least for me, for a long time, was finding a definition that made sense, finding a definition that didn't feel limiting. And oftentimes I find that the traditional medical model of a way of understanding addiction, it's better than the old model, which was, and that starts in substance abuse, right? That a lot of the times the medical model is talking about substance abuse, not addiction in general. But the original model is that somebody who's an addict is a deviant, is a bad person, they're a liar, they're a manipulator, and they need to be punished and beat down in submission, and that's the only way people stay sober. The medical model comes along and they say, well, they're actually ill. It's a disease. It's a brain disease that's uncurable because once you make those connections, it's never going to get better. So we need to treat them in a little bit of a different way towards abstinence. So at least it's a little bit more humane. It's a bit understanding that addictions are a brain disorder that are related to compulsive behavior, tolerance, and withdrawal, and that the only way to fix this is, or the only way to make it better, not fix, is through abstinence. So even though that's better, it still feels limiting. And I was reading a great book that I highly recommend by Gabor Mate, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. He does a really good job of connecting some of these ideas in the relationship between trauma and addiction. And he has a definition there that I think is not his. I can't remember if he quotes who the definition is from. And in this definition, they say that there are three things that are important to understand, or components of an addictive behavior. The first one is that it provides craving relief and pleasure in the short term. So basically what that means is that it feels good. People engage in things that give them a sense of pleasure. It has a dopamine release and it's a pleasurable activity. So in the 24 years that I've been working, I have never met anybody that's addicted to something they don't enjoy. It might not sound enjoyable to me, but it's enjoyable to them. So the first part of understanding is that it is triggering this pleasurable experience or relieving discomfort for the individual. And in the short term, it simply works. It simply does that. What happens is, as people continue to engage in these behaviors, there's negative consequences in the long term. The negative consequences could be anything, and it could be very individualized: relationships, health, mental health, ability to be present, and so on. And here is the third part, which I think it's the most important, and what makes this a little bit different. It's a nuance of difference, but it's an important difference. There's an inability or unwillingness to give it up. Why is that important? Because we're not just looking at the relationship that is this negative consequences and people continue to use. It's an understanding that they are unable to give it up. And the reason this is important is because nobody does something to self-destruct and continue to do it just for the fun of it. I have noticed that, there's no rules in our world, but it's very common that the more severe the addiction, a lot of the times, the more severe the trauma story. In most people, I've noticed this to be true. The greater the need to anesthetize, the greater the pain. So it begins to give us a sense that this engaging in this pleasurable activity, and sometimes the pleasure is only for a few seconds. It doesn't even last long time, but it's so intense and it makes the pain go away that it's a worthy trade-off to know that there's going to be these consequences of pain and discomfort that will come. So I'm willing to trade a moment of bliss for hours of discomfort. And I have heard, I worked with this young man a long time ago who said he was abusing heroin. And he said, if I stop using heroin, I'm going to die. But he said it with conviction. It was really fear. And the death that he was talking about was not physical death. It was emotional death, because there was so much pain and so much trauma in his life that he would describe shooting up as the warmest, loving embrace, the only time in his life where he felt loved. Even though through the years it only lasted a few seconds, and most of his drug use was to prevent feeling sick more than to enjoy the high, he was very, very aware that the only times where he would feel that sense of value was when he was shooting up. So this is giving us something really, really important. We need to begin to look at the function of the addictive behavior. And in understanding the function, it begins to give us a better understanding of what it's taking care of. For most individuals, the addiction or the addictive behavior is taking care of an emotional need or a connection need. And once we start looking at the need to be validated, the need to be loved, the need to be seen, the need to be taken care of, those are never pathological. The way we engage in satisfying those needs with time become dysfunctional, with time become maladaptive and pathological, we could say, but the need was not. And separating that is key in the process of recovery, separating the need from the way I was satisfying it, because we need to take care of that need still. But we find this effective ways, especially in the beginning, that support the quenching of that thirst. So the best way to understand addiction is from a developmental perspective, because when we are working with someone who's an adult and they have this history of destructive behavior, it's so hard to understand and connect. But the best way to understand addictive behaviors is to go back to when it began. Some people with 8, 9 years old, some people are 12, some people in their 20s, depending on the engaging behavior. But we need to go back and understand the moment where it was a functional creative adjustment. This is a really, really important word, functional, because it works. There's a point in every single person who develops addictive behaviors where it was doing what it was supposed to do. It allowed them to survive. It allowed them to get through pain. It allowed them to make social connections. Now, was it healthy? Of course not. But it allowed them to survive a moment in time when there were no other resources. So it's the ultimate creative adjustment that works for a period of time. So if we want to get to understand addiction, if we want to get to understand how things got to the destructive point, we need to go back to the point where it was functional. And in a way, it's a way of self-medicating. That's a term that is often used in the recovery world. And as I mentioned earlier, the goal of every addictive behavior is to change the brain chemistry of the brain, to control the dopamine production, to allow me to survive these comfortable moments. So this is an example that some of you have maybe heard. I definitely use it a lot because it's a great analogy. Some of you that have heard me speak have heard me say this before, so I apologize for the repeated and metaphors, but the best way of understanding addiction is related to boiling frogs. Maybe some of you have heard this example, maybe some of you know how to boil frogs, but basically the way that it's done is that they don't have the water boiling and throw the frogs in there because they jump out. So the way they do it is that they have the water nice and comfortable, and they put the frogs in there, and slowly, very, very slowly, small increments begin to increase the heat. So by the time the water is boiling, it's too late for the frogs to notice and get out. That is the best way of understanding addiction. Because we might see the water boiling now and it makes no sense. It's hard to understand how can someone be consuming so much substances or be engaging in sexual behaviors that ends up having physical damage to their body, and they need to do it again and again and again, and they can't stop. We need to go back to when it was a functional, when the water was nice and comfortable, when it used to be a thing that supported and helped me get through. Why this is important is because if not, it just feels like this unexplainable self-destructive behavior. And it's not. It's something that at one point allowed me to survive. It was the raft that allowed me not to drown. Sometimes I'll use the analogy that if you're in a river, you know, the high stream, and you're going down and you can't get out and you're beginning to drown, and you see this log, you grab onto the log. It's going to save your life. It's the best thing that could happen to you. But later, as you're holding onto it, you realize it was covered with spiders, you know, and they begin to bite your arm. Now it's the worst thing that could happen in your life. However, we need to go back to the point where you were drowning and it allowed you to survive, because that's key. And it begins to connect to pain. It begins to connect to trauma. So Gabor Mate has this saying that I like, that and what this allows us to is to begin to understand that addiction is not the problem. is the attempt to solve the problem. And that shift in paradigm is so important. Michael Clemens, who has one of the books about recovery, about working with addiction and Gestalt beyond sobriety, talks about, I think we're all familiar with the cycle of experience. And he says that for the addict cycle of experience is this very narrow experience where we want to get from sensation to withdrawal as soon as possible. And is skipping all these parts in the middle. We don't want to get to awareness. We don't want to get to contact and assimilation. We just want to have the sensations, they come up. I want to disconnect as soon as possible and move as quickly as possible to withdrawal. So when we start to understand this and see the function of the addiction, understanding from a functional perspective, for me, something shifted that was really important. I could be working with someone who's a liar, a manipulator, who I need to convince to be abstinent as the only way to survive in their life. And they're engaging in self-destructive behaviors and they're stubborn. Or there's someone who has pain and it's a way of surviving. They engage in this behavior that with time became maladaptive and destructive. But what they're trying to do is survive because there's this amount of unprocessed experiences that they're carrying that they don't know how to manage. So I don't know about you, but that one seems a lot easier to have a relationship with. And that matters significantly. Something that I'm very passionate about, and one of the many reasons I love Gestalt therapy, is that we have an understanding and the focus on the relationship, on the co-created space between therapist and client. And how we come to that space as therapists matters significantly. So if I see somebody as a human being in pain that has engaged in destructive behaviors, and therefore they're going to push me away, they're going to keep me at a distance, they're going to do whatever they need to do to survive. And instead of saying that as bad behavior, I see it as survival behavior, needed behavior. It changes the therapeutic relationship immediately, because addiction is no longer this menacing, horrible thing. It's a much needed survival mechanism that has become maladaptive. I love the word maladaptive because it implies at one point it was adaptive. At one point it was functional and useful. And I have found that in working with people and making that connection to, at one point this was useful, at this one point this was functional, it begins to open the door to consider something different, versus the only way you're going to be able to be okay is by stopping this thing that you've been doing to survive. So I'm going to take a little bit of a moment, see if there's any thoughts, questions at this point before I continue.
Hi, Rafael.
Hi, yes.
Hi, I'm in a park, so I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you fine, yes.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you could say a little more about the jump from sensation to withdrawal.
Yes, about the cycle of experience?
Yeah.
Of course. Yes. So let me go back to that slide here. So the idea is that when we have experiences that we're able to process and assimilate, the cycle of experience is much wider, right? I don't have the original Sinker's original drawing here, but let's see if I could draw an example. So the cycle of experience might look something like that. Much wider, much longer, right? So I'm going through all the different moments of awareness, mobilization of energy, action, contact, assimilation, and withdrawal. And this is a full experience. So what we know is that we tend to have ways of interrupting this cycle, right? And this is in the literature in a lot of ways. And in the old school Gestalt, it was like the defense mechanisms were the interrupters of the cycle, right? Introjections, projections, retroflexion, and so on. So the idea of Michael Clemens is that a good way of understanding addiction is that the individual begins to have an experience. pain, sadness, relationship, anguish, whatever it might be, that it's a complicated process, that it's an unpleasant sensation, or just even joy, even happiness, even connection that is threatening to their well-being. My perspective is because it's related to that unprocessed pain of trauma. So going through this process of awareness and assimilation and having to take some sort of an action and having to be in contact, it's too uncomfortable, it's too threatening. So what they want to do is get from here to here as soon as possible. And addiction is a great way, because the moment that I engage in whatever behavior has that dopamine hit and has this sense of disconnect and anesthesia, then I'm, as soon as possible, I'm moving to withdrawal. But what happens is that we begin to accumulate a bunch of experiences that we never process, that we never integrate. This is actually a great way of understanding why a lot of times there is some unprocessed pain that we call trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more about trauma next. But then I begin to accumulate, a lot of times in addiction, a lot more of this painful, unprocessed traumatic experiences. You see this in a lot of people's stories where they have significant amount of trauma from their addictive behavior. So it's a great way of understanding that the goal of addictive behavior, its protection, is to get us to not experience, to withdraw, to be away from experiences that are potentially painful, and not connect, and not be aware, and not in contact. But unfortunately, it leads to a long amount of unprocessed experiences that just begin to pile on and make life more unbearable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was thinking also, sorry for the ring, about how in my work with addicted people, I would often encounter people with a lot of conflict avoidance. So that reminds me of it when you say that you kind of avoid the whole part of the cycle.
Correct. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I mean, of course. Yeah. I think that avoidance. What's interesting about that is that in some ways, as a behavior becomes compulsive, and that compulsiveness takes over somebody's life, and it takes over control. That's what addiction is at the end of the day. It is implied in that I am not engaged in connecting and making contact. I'm seeking a constant stage of withdrawal. And what's really interesting to me is it is important to understand that piece of it, but what actually is behind that need to withdraw in such intense ways? What is behind that need to live in this way where you work in recovery, and especially around the substance abuse world, you probably heard these stories where people wake up in the morning, they take some sort of stimulant, amphetamine, meth, cocaine, whatever it might be. And then they manage their day this way. And then at the end of the day, they need to take some sort of depressant, a benzo, alcohol, weed, something that slows them down. And they create this routine. And some people are masterful at it, where their whole day, it's managed by substances. And then if they want to go party, they might throw some MDMA there on the weekend, right? So they constantly have this false sense of control of their mental stage and their mental status, and they're able to, they begin to manage their life through substance. Of course, it gets out of control eventually, but that is telling us something, right? It's not telling us, oh, this person's, abusing substances. It's telling us that need for management and control, that need to have a sense of my life is predictable in some ways. Because if I take that away, it becomes unpredictable. It becomes too overwhelming. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Good question. So let's talk about trauma now. So actually, before I get to this slide, there's something that I always like to clarify when I do this, because I think it's important, because we have this understanding as trauma. And in the trauma world, there's a couple of things that I think are moving in the right direction, but sometimes I believe that they don't quite connect for me, or they don't quite help us understand trauma. And one is that, and we'll be talking about this, trauma is not about the events. It's about what happens inside. It's about what the impact that it has in our body. And in order to understand this is an analogy that I use often with clients. So if you imagine that this is a soda can, this bottle is a soda can, and I take a big rock and I throw it against the can, it's going to leave a big dent on it, right? It's going to be reshaped. The can is not going to be in the same way. It's not going to operate in the same way. It's not going to look like it used to. Sometimes it's a good way of understanding trauma, because there are situations like that that are massive moments in our life. Abuse, a death of a parent, war, a terrorist attack, living in a place where there's a lot of violence and so on. So there are significant events in somebody's life. But once again, it's not about the event, it's about the dent that it leaves. The one, convenient thing about big events is that often there's an easy way of having a correlation. I keep the analogy of the can. I see this rock, I clearly see how it fits into that dent. More often than not, this is how trauma happens. If I take the same can and I have a bunch of pebbles, little pebbles, and I constantly throw it against it, I constantly hit the can with pebbles, it's going to be reshaped. It's going to have hundreds and hundreds of little dents. The challenging thing is that it's impossible to figure out which little pebble caused the dents. So the only way to understand it is to look at the pile, to look at the whole of it. But it has impacted and reshaped the can. So more often than not, trauma is not about significant events. It's about constant patterns, constant familiar patterns, social patterns, growing up in a household where there's unrealistic expectations, where there's an absent father, where there's explosiveness, where there's addictive behaviors, etc. So it's not one event, it's an accumulation of experiences that reshapes how I see myself and see the world. Oftentimes, and I think this is true, when you look at that big dent, to use the analogy of the rock, if you look at the can, it probably already had a bunch of little dents there before. Often when I work with people who are survivors of sexual abuse, and when that story is shared in therapy, a common question that I ask is, who did you tell? And you probably already know this. The most common answer is no one. That is the essence of the trauma, that there was no safe person to talk. And that could be about getting bullied. That could be about getting mistreated in school. That could be about having challenging times academically. That could be about falling in love and getting your heart broken. There's many experiences, but that I have this sense that it remains unspoken. It's something that no one can hold for me. So I have to keep it in. That is the essence of trauma. That's what begins to be this destructive nature. So one of the 4 ways that it impacts adult life is that there's a loss of response flexibility. What does this mean? It means that my ability to adapt to moving situations, my ability to be present in the world, my ability to experience new ways of being, to interchange experiences, it's very limited and it becomes very narrow. The more significant and the more developmental trauma, the narrower my world becomes. What I'm able to tolerate, what I'm able to do, how I'm able to interact with the world, my ability to adapt is impacted. There's also a fundamental disconnect from the self, which basically means, and this is the best way for me to understand it, when I have significant amount of trauma, I hold it in my body. There's nothing more uncomfortable when somebody has significant trauma than to be in their body. It's actually a really important thing to be aware of, because often in Gestalt therapy, we're very body process focused, which is great. But if we do it too early, without knowing how much the client's able to sustain, it could actually be the most threatening, uncomfortable experience for someone to have them go into their body, because that's where we hold the pain. So there's a disconnect from myself. There's a disconnect from my body, from my ability to connect, because that's where the pain lives. So I operate in this very disconnected way. And sometimes people can appear to be extremely functional and to do really well. And they're playing a role and they play it well, but it's not an embodied experience. And it shapes the world. So as I was saying with the can example, as I am affected by the way I see the world is completely different. What is safe and what is threatening, it's severely impacted. And what I think is one of the most detrimental parts of this, it makes it impossible to be in the present moment. I see the world from the perspectives of the past, from the hurt child, from the angry adolescent. It makes it really hard for me to be in the world from the eyes of the adult. Actually, a big part of this work is allowing individuals to come to a sense of their adulthood, to come to a sense of their ability to have chance and choice and opportunities that they didn't have as children. I remember, I love this example that I found it in, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jorge Bucay. He's an Argentinian Gestalt psychiatrist that's written a bunch of books. But he has this book that's all about metaphors and stories. And when I read this, it really resonated because I remember as a child, and I'm sure some of you remember this, when we used to go to the circus, there was the elephants. When the circus was not on, the elephants were outside. And there was this rope around so you couldn't get near them. And they were held on by this chain and shackle and this stake in the ground. It was not a big stake. They could literally just pull their leg up and run for it, but they didn't. And I remember as a child just wondering, why doesn't the elephant leave? I think I got an answer like, oh, because, they love performing and this is their home, so they don't want to leave. So it was not until I was reading Jorge's book, which, it made a lot of sense, but he talks about a similar story, but he got a real answer when he was little, at least allegedly in his book. And the real answer, unfortunately, is quite tragic. When the elephant are babies, they get shackled and chained and they do try to escape. And they keep going until they break their skin and it's so painful that they stop. So here it's this beautiful, majestic animal who has all this power. And to that chain and shackle, there's still a helpless little baby. There's still a helpless child. That for me is the best way to understand the impact of trauma. We are not in the present. We go back to that small little child. I remember something that happens very often to me. Whenever I can, I try to use actual examples from my life so it feels a little more real. Whenever I go to, especially to a conference, which is quite interesting that I'm one of the conveners of the conference in Veracruz, but I know enough people now with this a little bit easier. But whenever I go to a conference and I don't know anybody, I immediately feel like a 6-year-old on my first day of school. And I am fairly tall, 6'2" for those in the US, a meter 88 for the rest of the world. So, but I literally feel everybody's an adult and I'm not. I feel like I'm looking up at them. It's a very weird experience. And all I want to do is run. And I used to get very angry at myself. I remember I went to a long time ago, one of Herb's books, when he published it, he invited me to go to his, book opening in somebody's house. Now I walk in, everybody's a stranger to me, and I felt so uncomfortable. And I was and the whole time I was beating myself up about not being able to talk to strangers. I've done some work and understanding where that comes from. So now when that happens, I have choices. I could find someone who looks nice enough and start talking to them. I could leave, or I could just walk around and talk to no one. And that changes my experience. I went to a conference that I presented in Denver last year, and for 24 hours, I spoke to no one. And it was amazing. It was wonderful because I didn't have to force myself to do something uncomfortable. So that is the essence of that impact. Right? We can be in the moment, but once we have awareness and we begin to build relationships with our trauma parts, it gives us choice. The choice doesn't mean the action, the opposite action. Sometimes the choice is to do nothing, but it's still choice. So I mentioned this a little bit before with the can example, but one of the best ways of of understanding trauma for me is to put it in this context of trauma is not the event or the situation. It's the internal imprint of the aftermath of pain without empathic support. This is key. This is really, really important for me because it's an imprint, it's something that is there, that follows us. But it's not about the fact that something horrible happened. Is that, going back to that example with the abuse, that there was not a safe person to go to, that there was not someone that could hold and support me, because horrific things happen. Pain is a part of life. It's unavoidable to experience pain. The problem is not pain. The problem is that when that pain is experienced, it has to be silent. Trauma thrives in the unspoken nature of trauma. And then we add the price of belonging to family systems where you can't talk about it. It has to remain secret. It has to stay within the family. So this is what begins to brew what we call trauma, which is the long-term effect of that unprocessed pain. But it starts from the inability to communicate and be held with my pain. If something horrible happens to me and I'm held in safety and I'm able to talk about it in an honest way, if I'm able to share without it being interrupted, the amount of pain and discomfort that is associated with this experience, the long-term impact on that is significantly mitigated. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a part of my life, but it is processed differently. So the best way of understanding trauma is that it's human painful experiences that were not able to be processed and shared. Because, I mean, Martin Buber said this and over 100 years now, healing happens in relationship. Healing happens when we are able to be held by someone and our story is listened to in a connect, supportive way. This is where our work becomes so important and valuable, because if we're lucky, we could provide a space. This is what I think is the most important thing we're able to do for someone. If we're lucky, we're able to create a space that is safe enough for the possibility of healing to emerge. And that's really an important word, possibility. So we don't heal, we don't make people better. There's no technique. EMDR is wonderful, but it's not magic. If we're lucky, we have enough space and connection with someone that we begin to provide an opportunity for this possibility of healing to emerge. Now, what is healing? And I think this is something that I've heard from Gabor Mate and a couple people in Gestalt, and this is my summary of it. Healing is when I'm able to experience pain and realize that the pain ends. That is the essence of healing. That I could share this painful experience with someone else, that I could be whole, and that moment passes. It doesn't mean the pain is erased. It doesn't mean it never comes back. But for that moment, the painful experience is shared, it is joined, and it ends. Yes, Lit.
I would add something to that, which to me has been worked with, and that is the ability to experience joy.
Yes.
Because so often the trauma happened at the beginning of something that was going to be joyful.
Correct. Yes. Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. One of the things that, you know, in the US, they have this saying, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? And that's when that happens very often with painful experiences. They get locked away. And a lot of times there was joy around that was never experienced. And loving experiences and so on. I worked with a man who was adopted when he was 8 years old from Russia into the United States. And he had horrific life experiences. His mother was a sex worker. His father was an addict. from the age of 4, he had to find, food in dumpsters and from neighbors. There was horrific things that happened in his life. When he was about 6, he was taken to an orphanage. So as we started doing a lot of work and eventually got to process some of the painful experience and started working through the pain, he began to remember that when his mom was home, she was very loving, and she would hold him and she would sing to him, and he felt really cared for by her. And these memories were gone from his awareness. And then he remembered that when the day his mom took him to the orphanage, he had a conversation with him and said, "You are not safe here and I cannot protect you. So I'm going to take you to a place where you will be safer." So that experience of abandonment shifted from an experience of love and protection. It was not ideal, but it was the best thing she could do to keep him safe. And eventually it led to him being adopted. And he actually landed in a very loving home in the United States, and parents that were very caring and so on. So the pain could not allow him to remember and connect with the experience of being loved and being cared for. So unfortunately, that's what happens when this gets locked down. It includes sometimes loving and caring experiences that are important to connect with, because there was a sense of I did have some value from my parents, even though they couldn't take care of me. Stephen Porges, who is the creator of the polyvagal theory and quite fascinating ideas, we're not going to go into this today because it will take the whole lecture, but he has a definition of trauma that I really like because it's simple and to the point. And as a Gestalt therapist, actually, it rang to me. So he says that trauma is a chronic disruption of connectiveness. That is it. That is the essence of it. It's chronic, it's ongoing, and it gets in the way of my ability to connect or to make contact, either internal or external, relational or interrelational. It gets in the way of my ability to see and connect with others. So as we begin to look at this, so if I am carrying all this amount of unprocessed experiences and pain, it creates this concept of who I am. I am not important enough, not valuable enough, not good enough, whatever it might be. And then I'm thrown into the world. And this happens for most of us around adolescence, where we have to walk into this world of high school and social structures and cliques and belonging and groups. This is a very challenging and key time. And there's a reason why most addictive behaviors start in adolescence. One is because there's natural curiosity in adolescence. And second is because it's the first time that social belonging becomes figural much more than ever before. So the best way that I have of understanding this relationship between addiction and trauma, it's in this little diagram that I created a few years ago. And let me share it here. So on one end, we have this unprocessed pain that we call trauma, this broken attachments, unexpressed emotions, and so on. So basically, to summarize it, pain that doesn't get to be processed and connected. On the other side, on the green side, we have pleasurable activities: sex, substances, falling in love, success, doing good in school, whatever it might be. And this by itself, once again, is not problematic. Enjoyable things are not immediate addictive behaviors. Unprocessed pain doesn't mean my whole life is ruined. But the more severe this is, the more that I accumulate, then, as I was talking about before, we get to the adolescence and we're carrying all the stuff that was unprocessed, it's believed, it's on things that can never be spoken, and so on. So I get to this place of adolescence where now I have this social structure around me, where there's a way that I need to find to belong. All these pressures, all these things that are challenging about stepping into adulthood. And there is a group of people that are always open for enrollment. I have the opportunity through the online workshops and a few of the in-person trainings to work with therapists from all over, from India, Africa, South America, Europe, Australia, all different places. And there's one common denominator. Well, actually two. The one is that all cats love attention and get in the front of Zoom. Doesn't matter where the cat lives, they love attention and they will interrupt their owners when they're on Zoom. That's a common behavior. Every cat, Russian cats, Indian cats, American cats, Mexican cats. The second common denominator is the impact of trauma and the group of people who are open for enrollment. It might be a little bit different. They might be in the forest. They might be behind the school. They might be in different places. And the substance might be a little bit different. Here in the US and in Mexico, it's the kids smoking pot behind the school. That group is always open for enrollment. They're always willing to take somebody in. They don't judge. Everybody's a friend. So not only do you now have a group that you belong to, but you get the added benefits of the substance. So this is that functional creative adjustment period. So the substance or success or falling in love or being coveted by the other sex or being academically successful, whatever it might be, begins to be so enjoyable that it makes this disappear for a moment. This is a story from a lot of people. I know I have multiple clients that have the story where, I started smoking marijuana and suddenly I was able to make friends. I started getting better grades. I was known. I was social. I had people knew who I was. So that's a functional creative adjustment. Not healthy, but functional, because it allows me to anesthetize the impact of this unprocessed pain. It allows me to connect and survive. Unfortunately, what happens for a lot of individuals, as this continues on, it begins to be so intertwined that they are just completely tied up. And I cannot see myself in the world without this green part, without the anesthetizing. Because if I stop, then all that's left is this pain. So this relationship between addiction and trauma, they become so interconnected. They become so joined that the idea of living without it is unbearable, because then all I'm left with is the pain. Going back to that client that I mentioned, if I stop using heroin, I'm going to die. It's because all I'm going to be left is this unbearable pain that I'm not going to be able to process, that I'm not going to be able to manage. It's just so destructive that it's going to eat me alive. So what happens is that I begin to find ways of disconnecting that are very successful. And in the long term, it becomes this compulsive behavior that takes over my life. And it becomes the figure of everything. And I cannot live and go on with life without it. Those that are joining us, welcome. So we have... And what I think this is important when we begin to see how interconnected they are, because something is really important to me, something that I like to bring awareness to. If let's say, put yourself in the experience of the client for a moment, right? So you've been surviving life, you have been dealing with painful, challenging situations, you have been managing through disconnecting in these ways. And somebody recommends this therapist that you could go to and talk to and engage with. And this individual, the invitation is, stop doing this thing that you've been doing for years to anesthetize and survive, because it's bad for you. So we could talk about everything that you never wanted to talk about. So you could feel all those painful experiences that you never wanted to feel. And eventually you're going to feel better. It's not a great invitation, right? If you take it as that, it's kind of shitty, honestly. It's like, go and experience all this crap that you never wanted to experience. However, there's something that is really important. It's the awareness that if we have enough holding space, if we have enough safety, we're able to create enough space, sharing these painful experiences, will become connected and engaging, not just being in discomfort. That as I'm able to be more in myself and more in my body and have a greater sense of who I am and create more space, literal space for exploring, I'm able to realize that there might be options to step into this sense of adulthood where there's choice, where at one point there was not. Hi, everybody that's joining us. Welcome. So when we begin to look at this from a broader sense, it is scary to believe that I could live in a world without anesthetizing and disconnecting. And that all those things that remain unspoken can be spoken. So what is the point of it, right? What is the point of working through trauma? What is the point of considering other ways of connecting? And I think that this is Miriam Taylor, Jim Kepner, are two Gestalt therapists that have written about trauma, and they have some ideas that put together here a combination of some of their thoughts, including mine, in terms of what does trauma healing look like? This is not a process. These are not steps necessarily. This is just ways of things to pay attention to and what is included in this processing. And there's a part of it that's this undoing, redoing, and mourning. This is really important because you often hear this story, and I know I definitely heard it multiple times, when somebody comes into treatment and they have this concept of, I hear this story all the time, I have this problem, I'm just going to stay with drinking alcohol just to make it simple. I drink alcohol because I love drinking. I had a beautiful childhood. I had a happy life. I had no problems. I just like drinking too much. This is the assumed reality in which they've been operating their whole life. And suddenly we begin to do this treatment, we begin to undo this story, and we begin to look at it and look at all this perspective. And suddenly there's this awareness that my assumed reality was no longer true. This idea of this happy childhood is like, oh, wait a minute, my dad was abusive, this happened, and all these experiences that I cut off from my awareness as a way of surviving are now coming to the surface. There's a significant loss that happens. There's mourning that happens in recovery. And also when I'm letting go of the addictive behavior, there's a loss. And I think it's really important because if we don't pay attention to that, if we don't make space for the processing of loss, for the mourning of recovery and healing, a lot of times it triggers a relapse. I've had plenty of people that relapse because they don't understand, how can I miss this behavior that was so destructive? I'm supposed to be happy without it, and I'm not. I'm miserable. A lot of the times recovery, it's an opportunity to heal, but it doesn't make easier. A lot of times it makes it a lot harder, especially in the beginning. So when we begin to unfold this trauma, when we begin to unfold this pain, there's a significant period of mourning because there's a loss of my assumed reality that allowed me to survive for many, many years. And it's important to make space for that pain, for those moments of loss to be experienced. And then we get to this idea of reprocessing and recontextualizing. So the re part here is because we're processing things that already happened most of the time. We're talking about experiences that are in our story. And reprocessing is this idea that I'm bringing it to the surface to untangle it, to understand it, to integrate it, to get a better sense of it, to create a new context of it, to have a new way of holding it in my life. I love this analogy that somebody shared with me a long time ago, and I really, if I knew who came up with the idea, I would quote them, but I don't. All I could tell you is that it's not my original idea. So if you think about this, I'm going to use the water bottle as an example one more time. Imagine this is a clear glass of water, and on the bottom there's sediments. Right. And you could see the sediments that it's accumulation of brown and black and green stuff down there, whatever color you want to imagine. So the idea is that therapy and processing is taking a spoon and beginning to stir this up. And when I begin to stir it, all those sediments in the bottom begin to come up. And now I can see them. I could see the color, the sides, the shapes, and that's very uncomfortable, right? This is a very difficult part of treatment, because when it's down here, it's there, but I can't really see it, and now it becomes clear. But if I stop steering, it's going to go back to the bottom and it's just going to stay there. So the idea is that we keep steering. Obviously, we take breaks, because if you keep on steering, it's going to be overwhelming. And the more I steer, the more I continue to do this, all those sediments begin to disintegrate, and they get a little bit smaller, and they begin to integrate into the water. So I love that analogy of understanding therapy in general, but more in particular when there's significant amount of trauma, which leads to this last part here in the slide, which is eventually we get to this point of transformation and transcendence. So it begins to change and shift. I begin to see myself clear. I begin to have a better sense of myself. Begin to be able to use those experiences to inform how I am in the world. This is something really important. It's not about finding the answer that makes everything well. This is actually something that I learned as a client first, then a therapist. So I remember many times being in therapy and having this wonderful aha moment and sounding like, oh, now I get it. I'm afraid of people because of this thing that happened to me. I worked through it. I gave a big hug to my child, and I rescued him from this experience, and I feel this loving connection. And then next time I'm in a similar situation, I feel exactly the same way. And I always felt like, oh, that didn't work. I need to go and figure out something else. Until I finally realized that therapy is not about answers. It's about relationships. It's about making more space and connecting with these parts of me, my younger self, my pain, my fears, whatever it might be, and knowing that they're going to be a part of my life. And every time it comes up, I have a different relationship with it. It's about building relationship with those parts, about building relationship with my fears, about building relationship with my sadness. So when it comes up again, I have a way of connecting with it and making space with it and having a relationship with it. So the idea of that transforming and transcendence is not that I'm healed and I'm without. Is that healing happens when I'm able to make space for my human experiences, when I'm able to make space for my fear, for my sadness, for my insecurities, for my sense of inadequacy. And I can relate to it and know that at times it's going to be overwhelming and take over. And what that shifts for me, it creates a space to relate versus to live in the consequences of. So when we think about transformation and transcendence, it's not a destination that is permanent. That's what I said earlier, that this slide in no way are steps. It's an ongoing process, because often we might be in the sense of, I have a better sense, and there's more mourning that happens. There's more revisiting my story that happens. And it's an ongoing process. It's never linear. One of the things that it's important as we begin to make space for this idea of including addiction as this creative adjustment that is worth exploring, of beginning to make connections. It's one of the things that I talk about him often for many reasons. One is that he was an amazing man, and second, that I was lucky enough to live in the same city that he did and build a relationship for the last 24 years. Talking about Irv Polster. And one of the things that was magical about Irv is his curiosity. He would be curious about the little things that would escape our awareness. And he always said that that's where the essence of therapy is being curious about the little things. And that's a lot of times where the most important parts live. So that curiosity is key as therapists. I think the best thing that we could do is be curious. And in that curiosity, the killer is to be determined to know. And that is the worst thing that we could do as therapists. We might have heard this story millions of times. We might have had similar clients. But the moment that we become deterministic and know, we get in the way of connecting. I mentioned this earlier. What is key in understanding the therapeutic relationship is that my presence in it matters. So the way that I'm approaching, the way that I'm seeing the client, the way that I'm connecting with the client, it's important and significant. It matters. So to remain curious, it allows this experience of moving and shifting to happen. So one of the ways that that to put some of these ideas together was this idea that I came up with. And I always say this, and those of you that know me hear me complain about this all the time, and I still haven't found a better way, but I don't love the title because it's basically a description. Compassionate Relational Gestalt Trauma Processing Model. It's a mouthful. But anyway, until I find a better name for it, it's just going to stay that way. What this is, it's more of a collection of ideas and a way of focusing and conceptualizing the work when we get to that point of beginning to process trauma, where there's enough sense of adult, there's enough sense of resiliency, somebody's able to be in their body, we have done enough resourcing, and we're ready to begin to dive into working through some of those painful experiences. I love the analogy of trees. I love trees, and I think that it's the best way of explaining it. Because like a tree without ground and nutrients, it's impossible for it to grow. So the ground here is that safety and stabilization, having enough safety, connection, relationship, that the client has enough resources, that they're able to stay in the present, that they're able to connect with their body without dissociating and so on. That's the bulk of the work early on and creating enough sense for this tree to stand on. The next, which I think is actually the most important thing that we can do, is the trunk. And the analogy of the tree, without a trunk, we only have like a bunch of leaves and weeds and things like that. So we need the tree needs a trunk. And this is the witness and communicate and validate the experience. Let me tell you what I mean by that. It's what I think holds the therapeutic relationship and exploration is when we could sit with the other and just be. This is key. It's not about the techniques. It's not about what we do. We tend to focus on the what too much in therapy, and we forget about the how. And that matters way more. I always tell students, and when I supervise people, all the fancy stuff that we do, the client doesn't care about that. That's just for us to figure out how to do work with certain situations. If they feel connected and safe and seen, the techniques will work. But if they don't, all you're doing is techniques. So to witness and communicate is to be present, to truly be present, to hear with more than my ears, to see with more than my eyes, to be in a willingness to be vulnerable with the other. So there's a part of me at stake. That's the essence of contact. I need to put some of me into this relationship for contact to happen. And I also need to learn how to withdraw and pull away for contact to happen, right? So to be a witness is to be active in my presence with the other. And validating the experience, it simply means believing. We are not detectives. We are not the seekers of truth. Whatever the story is, whatever somebody's sharing, it's their truth and it's valuable and it's important for it to be held and listened to. But here's the most important part. It doesn't include a lot of words. We tend to contaminate experiences with words because when somebody's sharing painful experience, when somebody's talking about this thing that has never been expressed before, we need to be with it. We need to create space for it to be. It's not about making it better. It's not about saying the right words. It's truly holding the space for this pain to be seen, for this pain to be validated, for this pain to be experienced. One of the things that sometimes is very uncomfortable, and I know still uncomfortable for me after all these years in teaching this, when somebody shares something very painful and horrific, and all we could do is be with that. Because of course we want to say something that makes it better. But actually, what makes it better is for it to be acknowledged for what it is. It is horrific and horrible that this happened. It is painful, and that pain needs to be acknowledged and seen. one of the most a great example of this and a very amazing learning experience for me. And I had talked about this before in some of my trainings, but it's a young man. It's a long story, but he had multiple surgeries throughout his life, ended up losing a leg, has had tons of over 50 surgeries in his life when he's 28, has had multiple situations. At one point was addicted to substances, and then he got sober and been sober for a while, and he had a functional life. And then problems came back with his leg and had to get more surgeries. And there was a chance that he was not going to be able to walk anymore with a prosthetic. And we were in this session when he came to this information, and he was in tremendous pain and despair and said, I'm thinking about killing myself or going back to using drugs. And I listened and I said, I understand that. And I heard him, and he talked about it, and he shared his pain. And I tried to hold the space, be with him. There was nothing I could say to change that. And at the end of the session, he said, I want to thank you because you're the only healthcare professional that has allowed me to talk about my pain without telling me it's going to be okay, without trying to make me feel better, without trying to give me hope. And I really just needed to be listened to. That's it. That's the essence of it. It doesn't stop there. Don't get me wrong, right? But when it comes to that part of sharing and being with, that's it. And it's not just listening passively. Once again, it's this being with. It's this connect, and it's being with the pain. It's making space. It's being affected by it. Fritz said a long time ago, I don't know if this was publicized or if Erd told me, sometimes I get my stories confused, but he said that if at the end of therapy, you are not changed, you didn't do Gestalt therapy. Because that's the essence of what we do. We're in it with them. And that in it with them matters significantly in the therapeutic relationship. It matters significantly in the co-created space. So let me go back to the tree real quick so I could talk about the few more pieces here. So the other things here are on this right side of the tree. They're in some ways of exploring understanding. They live a little bit on the cognitive place a bit. So this making space for protectors actually should be making space for antagonists. I thought I had changed it, but this might be an old slide. So the idea is that this is a whole module. I'm actually going to do an experimental workshop in Veracruz. It's called I think it's called Making Space for Your Antagonist, or Creating a Relationship with Your Antagonist, something like that. But it's about exploring this whole idea of antagonist and the core beliefs. Let me talk about this briefly about the antagonist, what I mean by that. So what I mean by antagonist is the interrupters of the story, just like in a novel, right? Something's happening and comes this person that gets in the way. For me, the antagonists are all the ways that we interrupt contact. So typically, let's say a quick little example, a client is making contact with the sense that when they were younger, the parents were absent, the father was very critical and really impacted me, and they're getting a little tearful and feeling this sense of dread of how horrible it was to not have a safe place to talk to and feeling not good enough, not wanted. And then suddenly it's like, this is bullshit. This happened when I was 8. Who cares? It doesn't matter. I mean, I'm 47. What does this have to do with anything? That's it, right? That's the antagonist. Or suddenly I am numb. Suddenly I'm laughing. Or, oh, I'm so stupid. Why does this matter? All those ways that we interrupt contact. Now, the key here is that I don't think we should call this resistance. I think that's a dirty word that we should not use. They are ways of surviving and adjusting that are quite wonderful and beautiful. So the idea is that we do the opposite. Instead of trying to go around them, we just let them in. Let's be curious about it. Let's explore it. Let's tell me more about this part that is saying this is bullshit. What does that feel like? What is this part doing for you? What is it taking care of? This is extremely valuable and useful information. And the other is that it's been around for a long time. So if it wants to interrupt, it will interrupt no matter what you do. So you might as well get to know this part. You might as well explore it. So a big part of trauma work, it's allowing these interruptions to happen, being curious about them, welcoming them, getting to know them, building a relationship with these parts. Because they have been taking care of the client for way longer than anyone else. And it's going to give us valuable information in a relationship. The other piece there on the right side was this idea of exploring fifth gestalts or beliefs. So the I'm not good enough, the I'm not valuable enough, but it's exploring from the sense at what point was that useful for you? At what point in your life, believing that you were not good enough, allow you to have a relationship with your parents? Which the opposite, oh, my parents are not able to take care of me. When you're 5, that is not a choice. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, even 14. It's not a choice to believe my parents are wrong. The only choice I have is I have to try harder to be loved because there's something wrong with me. I'm oversimplifying here because this is what we talk in the trainings in much more depth. But all those things are worth exploring, are part of understanding trauma. What beliefs I created around it that allow me to survive? What are the ways that I protect myself in this extreme ways that at one point it was the best option I could have? And on the other side of the tree, on the left side on the screen, we have ways of working that are probably much more attuned to our Gestalt way of working. So emotional awareness, it's important. Helping people connect with the feeling, helping people, this thing that I'm feeling right now, the tightness in my chest, what is this? What is the feeling? And the body processing. Now, there's multiple ways of doing body processing. In Gestalt, we have people, Ruella and Jim Kepner and a bunch of other people who do great body work. There is somatic experiencing outside of Gestalt work. EMDR to some extent is a way of working with the body. There's a trauma resiliency model with this woman like Elaine Miller Caras, which is amazing. The point is that it almost doesn't matter how, because there's a lot of great ways, and it's whatever makes sense for you. What's important is to be aware that that's part of healing. The embodied experience, the accessing, not just the pain, but the healing from a physiological embodied sense. It's an important part of the work. And a lot of times, the avenue to get to the body is through the antagonist. Because until this part is settled, it's really hard to make space to be in the body. Finally, this idea of exploring meaning is it's a concept more related to just when we do this work, we do want to see what does this mean now? How does this inform your life now? Because as we know, the work that we do is irrelevant if it was not impacting somebody's present. So we do want to explore, what does this connect to? What does this mean in your relationships now? How does this shift the way that you are present at work or with your partner, how you're present as a parent, whatever it might be. But basically, what this is inviting is that the process of healing trauma requires enough time to be invested in that bottom part of it, in the connecting, the building relationship, the it being safe enough. And that's what it allows us to make space. When we talk about making space, it's a very literal definition that we're talking about having enough space within my body to explore, having enough space in the therapeutic relationship to move around and explore, having enough space within my sense of awareness to explore. Because when we come to it, and this is what I said earlier, that one of the impacts of trauma is that it's very narrowing. It's very narrowing in my ability to connect. It's very narrowing in my ability to connect with the world, to interact with others. So part of the healing process is to expand that space so I could take in a little bit more, so I could create a little bit more space. Now, there's one final piece that I always like to talk about, and this is something that I add pretty much everywhere I speak, because the reality is that we operate and work in a weird way. Our job is to have this intimate relationship with someone that we're not in an intimate relationship with. And we're connected and engaging, but they're going to live their separate lives. And it's challenging and it's taxing and it's difficult. And sometimes, and we all experience this, sometimes it's hard to grab onto, why am I doing this? What's the purpose of this? I know I have had days and weeks where it's the stuff that's coming out with my clients is so taxing, and then the world is crazy, and then I have my own family and stuff. So one of the things that I think is really important is to remember and grab onto something that gives us a sense of purpose. For me, that is hope. And when I say hope, I'm not talking about things are going to be okay kind of hope. That's more of a greeting card kind of hope. It's more of a sense of, what can I grab onto to remember that this is worth it? To remember that this going through this process of walking through the muddy lands of pain, it's worth it. That despite everything that's happening in the world, there's still beauty in the world. So what actually helps me is to find that sense within myself that I trust that what I'm doing is meaningful and worth it. But more so for me is that humans are worth it. Because despite the fact that we do horrible things to one another, as a whole, we're actually not that bad, right? When you look at most people, when it comes down to it, they will help their neighbor. They will take care of one another. There's the 5% that are shitty and probably are destroying parts of the world. But as a whole, human beings are worth it. As a whole, human beings, what for me is when I can understand the essence of pain and the impact of it, and look beyond the protectors, look beyond the ways that I adapt to the world that can be very destructive. There's a sense that humans are worth it. And a great reminder of that is children, because that's when every human is valuable, and especially every child. So there's this story that I like to share, and it's probably, you probably have heard it before, at least some of you, but I love the story, so I'm going to share it anyway. Somebody told me this when I was like 18, and it stuck with me. So it's a story that I have no idea if it's true or not, but it sounds nice for it to be true. So let's make it a true story. So there's this man that goes out for a run on the beach. And it's early in the morning, and there was high tide. There was very high tide the night before. There was a storm. So the sand is covered with starfish, right? So he starts his run, and he's this little 6-year-old girl who is grabbing, the stars and throwing them back into the water one by one. So the man goes on his run, comes back about an hour and a half later, which I'm told by people who run, this is normal, that's how long it takes to run. So anyway, that he comes back, and the little girl's still going at it, right? And just one throws it into the water, one throws it into the water. And the man says, "What are you doing?" The little girl says, "I'm saving the starfish." Grabs one and throws it into the water, right? And the man says, there's like hundreds of thousands of them. You're never going to finish. And the girl listens, grabs the next one and throws it in the water. And he's like, besides, who cares? And the little girl grabs one stars and says, "This one cares." Throws it into the water, grabs the next starfish and says, "This one cares," and throws it into the water. That is it. We can save all the starfish, but the people we touch in our personal life, in our professional life, how we're with them, it matters. So for me, that's the essence of hope, that what I do matters. It might not change the entire world, but my family, the people that I connect with, my friends, the best possible presence matters. And that gives me hope. And hopefully that helps. All right. So I will end the recording now, so we could have a little bit more dialogue openly, and this won't be in the recording. The recording is for people who would have not able to join us here live, so they can have it available. I guess before I end the recording, just so it's in the recording, let me just share this slide real quickly that has my contact info. I a week ago, I was convinced to get on Facebook and Instagram. I have never been on Facebook and Instagram. I was talking to my friend Lena from Belarus, who said, you need to get on Facebook because nobody reads email. So I did it, and that's my Facebook account now. It's a week old, and I will be putting stuff in there of what's coming up. All right. So let's stop this now, and we'll move.